Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. Very excited.
I'm afraid I lost you there,
Didn't have
Aaron.
CR Wiley. He is a Presbyterian minister and author of the books. Hello?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're cutting out a little bit, Aaron.
Yeah.
You're fine right now, but for
Okay.
a
So
second
am I
there,
cutting out a little bit? Well, let me do something here. Let me try something. Can you hear me now?
oh yeah,
Okay,
yeah, hopefully,
good.
yeah,
So do you happen to have a couple copies of the books with you?
sure. I've always got them.
Oh, good. So people can. Okay, Household in the War for the Cosmos. I can see that one.
And then
Man of the House. Yeah, so I bought them both, but they're both on Kindle, and the Kindle it will have a cover on it, but it's not as good. So your actual name is Chris, right?
correct.
So and you'll go by Chris. How did you end up as CR Wiley?
Well, it's I always feel a little pretentious when I refer to myself as CR Wiley because when people hear you refer to yourself by your initials, you think of C.S. Lewis or J.K. Rowling or somebody like that. I don't think I'm in their league or anything. It all came down to Google search. That was it. So I typed in one day. You know how you do this? You get on Google and you say, "Wow, let me see if I can find me." And so I typed in Chris Wiley, and about 5 million Chris Wileys come up, and some of them are pretty well known. And so I realized if people want to find me on Google, they're not going to find me by just typing in Chris Wiley. They got to go through a bunch of other people before they get to me. So I experimented and discovered that CR Wiley was pretty much unclaimed. And then, next thing you know, I'm writing stuff under that moniker, and people can find me right away. So if you do a Google on CR Wiley, I'm like the first 5 pages. So I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, Aaron Wren is a relatively distinctive name, or so I would think. But there actually are quite a few people named Aaron Wren out there. I'm like friends with one of them on Facebook. He just friended me. It was actually an Asian guy.
Really?
So we had a good we had a good laugh at that. It's like but I do control the top rank on Google for myself because I've been so it's like that's important. But I may have to switch if somebody else comes along and dethrones me. I may have to switch to AM Wren.
Right.
So
right.
what do you mean when you talk about a household? Because don't we all already? Doesn't everybody live in a household basically?
Right. Yeah, that's a question that's an ancient one. If you go back to, Xenophon's Oikonomikos, he starts off the dialogue, Socratic dialogue, with that very matter. So there's always been some confusion concerning what are we talking about when we talk about a household? Talking about a physical structure? Are we just talking about something that's synonymous with family? But throughout, Western history anyway, and I think even beyond that, the distinction is between, say, an institution which shelters not just people, but also other things like productive activity and actual property. So sometimes people would refer to it, at least in English-speaking countries, as an estate. But you can still see the use of the term household even in our tax code. When you say, I'm head of a house, head of household. So there's still, I think, some sort of usage, at least legally, to this institution that shelters people, and it doesn't sort of entail dwelling in a particular institution, which has some physical assets, which can include physical buildings. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about a household is a kind of a authority structure, which is something that does house families, but can also include more than just simply people who are related by blood. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the way I use it.
So what would be an example? What would be the difference between like when you talk about a household and like what we would mean today? So like I live in a house, I have my family. Are you talking about that, or are you talking about something beyond that, or more than that?
Well, I'm talking about something more than that. It's always included what you just described. It's always uh, included family members living together. But over the course of the last few hundred years, certain things that were considered necessary to having a household and having it work have been kind of hived off or outsourced. So, an example of that would be productive work. So, in household, historically, the household was understood to be a place where people were doing productive things, uh, things that would, help them, live, earn a livelihood, or just subsist, as in terms of a subsistence economy.
Yeah. So like a farm or a blacksmith shop or something like that. So
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
yeah, so I think about it, it's interesting that term oikonomos is where we get the word economy.
Right.
And so the household, the pre-industrial world, and essentially economic production took place in basically home-based. I didn't want to call it a business. Probably people didn't even think of it as a business
Right.
in a lot of ways, but sort of a home-based environment where a lot of productivity took place. And how did you get interested in this topic of the household?
Well, one of the things that inspired me to look deeper into it was the fact that, family life in the Western world has been undergoing some tremendously disruptive change. And so as I saw this, and I'm not the only person who's observed this. I noticed that most people, in their attempt to defend the integrity of households or family life, maybe that's a better way to put it, would go directly to either psychology. In other words, a family is a place where we feel secure, or where everybody feels like they belong, or people can enjoy each other's company, those sorts of things, or pedagogical. There's pedagogical sort of activities, like raising children, teaching them how to be virtuous and be productive members of society. But it seemed to me that something about that needed to be further enhanced, or maybe a better way to put it is I saw that there was something that wasn't being talked about, that I had grown aware of through my studies with regard to particularly the Western political tradition. So, like when we think about, say, Aristotle's politics or his ethics, he addresses the household in a more capacious way, fuller way. He refers to its sort of political functions as a household participates in the polis, or he talks about its economic functions. And those were things that many people, like a person like James Dobson, I don't know if some of our listeners remember him, but
He's not from that long ago. He's not that long ago.
that's
Focus
right,
on the
that's
family.
right. Focus on the family. He was always, focused on what I noted earlier, the psychological dimensions of the household, or the pedagogical functions of a household. But he never got into these other things that Aristotle talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But that other stuff was sort of like the bread and butter of households for thousands of years around the world, not just in Western culture, but in the East, and even in, the Americas and Africa and so forth. So I wanted to understand that more. And so I did a lot of work, did a deep dive on, sort of the household as an institution that had political and economic functions in a society. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized, wow, I think that this stuff is still relevant and still very important. And maybe I should just kind of try to bring that wisdom from the past into the 21st century and try to apply it.
Yeah, with the shift from a sort of a pre-industrial to an industrial economy, when economic functions mostly move to a marketplace setting, physically located outside the home, and in which the state has absorbed many functions that were previously carried out in the home, like education or the social safety net or a health care or many other things that you might have ever done in a home. I always think about even defense.
Correct.
Back in England, you had to raise the hue and cry, or you would get a posse out in the old west, and people would just go
Yeah.
chase down the back. Well, now it's like everything's very organized. It's
Right.
either very market driven or very state driven. And you're right, the household is spoken of. I think it was Christopher Lash who wrote this book called A Haven in a Heartless World to
Yeah.
describe the family, and that's sort of how I think a lot of people view it.
Right. Yeah, and
Today.
as you know, that book was his critique of that way of thinking about households. It's a great book, but he was one of the people who really got me kind of moving in the direction kind of early on, because I think that book was written in the late 70s, and maybe I read it in like the mid 80s. And but he was certainly aware of this older and richer understanding of households.
Yeah. So I want to dig more into that, but before we start really diving into man of the house and some of the things that you were suggesting there, I want to talk a little bit about you and kind of your background, because you're a very fascinating person. I think. Well, for one thing, you were, as I recall, you were actually raised in a Scientology environment.
That's
Is
right.
that right? How did you end up how did that happen?
Well, my father, this was the late 60s, when everybody was seeking and no one was finding, I came from an Episcopalian household, a home that was where both my folks were Episcopalians, and I was baptized Episcopalian as an infant. But, this was the 60s. My father was an academic. My mother was she was very artsy, bohemian kind of person, and very lefty. And so I was in this sort of environment, near college campuses. So my father was at the University of Buffalo and then later at Washington U in St. Louis. But he was a seeker and dabbled in different things, Unitarianism, the Baha'is and stuff like that. But eventually landed in Scientology. And I think he got into Scientology when I was about 6 years old or so. And so between the ages of maybe it was five or so, and about 11, I was, pretty fully immersed in that world. And my father ended up deserting our family when I was 11. So that's one of those dark providences where, there's an upside to it, because of that development. I didn't, during those formative teenage years, I wasn't in that world any longer. I was in a very different place at that time. I was in Western Pennsylvania, which was almost about as different from the world I had come out of as you could possibly imagine. Because, I was in a sort of a bohemian environment where there was beads and Buddhas and incense and, because of the kind of the ethos of the late 60s, early 70s around college campuses and among, kind of middlebrow people and kind of minor intellectuals and stuff. And then thrust into this blue collar world of Western Pennsylvania, where everybody works in a factory, and it's right out of like The Deer Hunter. I don't know if you remember that film. It really was that way. Yeah, it really was that way. When I watched The Deer Hunter, I say, man, that takes me back, back to Western Pennsylvania. So I went from this sort of bohemian, artsy, experimental lifestyle world to Norman Rockwell's America. Huh. So my childhood was more the Bohemia, and my teen years were kind of Norman Rockwell. Except I was in the projects at that time, and I was my mother was in and out of mental institutions. So I was pretty much on my own from the time I was about 11 years old, and I spent time in foster care and stuff. But anyway. Wow. So there's a lot of weird stuff there, but it was during my teen years that I was converted, became a Christian, and I'm very grateful for that. And that was another whole thing, a whole world that I entered into. So,
well, that's quite an eventful childhood, and I mean a lot of things that are maybe it's an overused term, but I call it traumas or like big changes in things. And how do you remember how you felt as a kid as this stuff was happening, the Scientology and then the father and...
Oh yeah, I felt it was very weird. I think that kids have a lot more sort of sense about the way the world should work than we give them credit for. And I think when parents are AWOL or nuts, I think kids know it. and they're torn because on the one hand, there's affection, and they want to be proud of their parents, and they want to believe in them, and on the other hand, they know that they're surrounded by insanity. So that was kind of the way I felt about it all. And so I remember kind of fantasizing about kind of a normal childhood at different points. But on the other hand, as I look back on it, there are many things about those experiences that make me who I am and have really helped me in ways I don't think I would have been able to help me to function in ways that I don't think I could function if I didn't go through those things. So, because of all that weirdness, I've got kind of a range of, I don't know, I suppose I'm more resilient than I would be otherwise. And I've got a lot more because I have. So, for example, my father's family pretty well off, and the old joke, whether high or low, the status is always quo when you're talking about the Episcopalians.
Right.
So that was kind of the sort of kind of the world. So like my grandparents had a mink farm of all things, and that was like an investment. That was the kind of world they looked like the Howells on Gilligan's Island. But my father was kind of a black sheep, and so he kind of cut everything off there, and then I was in this sort of world of ethnic religious minorities, people, so a lot of my friends during my childhood were Jews and blacks. So I grew up in with a kind of an interesting array of experiences with those folks, and I had great affection for a lot of them and enjoyed my friendships with them. And then I was thrust back into this sort of middle America kind of Trump country thing. And so because of that range of experiences, I'm very comfortable with very wealthy people, very poor people, blue collar people, white collar people, intellectuals, that kind of thing. So I feel like I've got good range because of all that.
A lot of people, who are raised in, call it like middle class suburbia, pretty stable home. They become adults, or they go to college, or maybe later in life they have a midlife crisis and they want to get involved in the beads and the dope and the other things. And,
right.
Do you feel like you are not as attracted to maybe some of these practices that others draw because you've experienced it, so now you kind of know the reality? Or how do you think you're less vulnerable maybe to certain things?
Yeah, I'd say I've been inoculated.
There you go.
We've been talking about inoculation
a lot
lately. Yeah, I do think I'm inoculated to sort of, I have a friend who's an architect down in Dallas, and he calls me a conservative hippie, and I think that's pretty right. I've got kind of an artsy kind of side, but at the same time, I'm kind of blue collar in terms of my sentiments and so forth. But I've had all sorts of friends, through the course of life, and people that I've known and been actually very fond of who are kind of radical lefties and stuff like that. And so because of that, I kind of see I've kind of had a chance to see sort of the dark side of different things. So like, sometimes people will say things like, well, one of the problems with patriarchy is all of the potential for sexual abuse that could happen within a patriarchal environment. Well, let me tell you something. You don't get away from sexual abuse in the world of the left. There is a lot. And that's one of the things that's coming out with this whole Me Too stuff. Have you noticed that all these people check off all the right boxes on the politically correct stuff, and then we discover that they're just monsters? It's just human beings are human beings, and they're fallen, and it doesn't matter what you talk about in terms of your political orientation. Some people on the left are sane and some are insane, and some people on the right are sane and others are insane.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I find it interesting to think about this household stuff. I think you typically think of it as a very conservative thing today. Homesteading is the sort of thing you do when you're ready to put in your arsenal and all that stuff. And I think a lot of my generation who didn't personally experience the '60s. My family was part of the kind of call it the end of the Jesus movement and the Back to the Land movement and all that. So I got some of it, but I was associated, again, this is all very lefty, which it is, but I think we miss that there was a kind of a conservative element in the counterculture, and that it
Okay.
was rejecting this industrialization, dehumanization, mechanization of society. It was looking for more authentic forms of community, ways to reconnect with nature. That I think in a lot of ways there was a somewhat conservative ethos to that. And my uncle, who never really left the '60s, he landed in northern California and was all this stuff. He was still living up in Humboldt County, if you know what's going on up there. And you talked to him at the end of his life. In a lot of ways, he's Jill Stein. After Bernie was gone, he voted for Jill Stein. But like he had a lot of conservative views in a lot of ways. And there was this very, like, for example, there was a very robust anti-technology movement on the left
Right.
that is just sort of totally disappeared.
Yeah, you remember the whole Earth catalog people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. You go up into Vermont, and you still see a little bit of that. I remember someone telling me that, when we think about the sort of like left and right, we think about them as on a line that's kind of a continuum that goes forever in either direction. Well, actually, it's more like this. You go so far left, you come around to the right. You can go so far right, you can come around to the left. It's that can happen.
Yeah. So I think one time you sort of mentioned, and I really don't know the answer to this myself, that you sort of knew or were associated with some entertainment industry figures, or
Well, I mean, my extended family is, on both sides, both my wife's family and my family have connections in those worlds. So my wife's more like Nashville, and then my side is more like LA and Hollywood. So one of my cousins is married to Madonna's producer, Gardner Cole.
Wow.
So that kind of thing. I'm not close to them. But it is kind of part of the extended family story.
So you weren't an extra in some Madonna video?
No, definitely not me. No.
No. So you said it in high school is when, or when you were a teenager, is when you became a Christian. So how did that happen?
Well, I was really in a bad place in terms of family life and just generally speaking, and I was befriended by a preacher's kid who became my best friend, and he wasn't like trying to evangelize at me or anything. He was just a kid, and we kind of hit it off, and we became good friends. And he had to go to church, because his father was the preacher. And so I liked hanging out with him, and I didn't have anything else to do. So I would go to church with him. So that's how it occurred, and how I came to hear the gospel and eventually, receive the grace to believe it. So, it was a kind of a lower middle class, evangelical kind of church, just great folks, not terribly, sort of profound with their theology or anything, but they were just exactly what I needed at that point in my life.
And, now you're a Presbyterian, which,
Right.
I would say it's like a one-notch downgrade from Episcopalianism. So
Right.
with all that background, how do you get into, what I think of as the most kind of upper middle class striver denominations tradition there is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually got connected to Reformed people paradoxically when I was doing urban ministry in Boston. So when I was involved with urban, sort of church planting amongst, ethnic minorities and immigrants in the greater Boston metropolitan area, there were other people from other denominations who were doing the same sorts of things. And I connected with a lot of those folks. And the guys that I really kind of had the greatest rapport with were the Reform guys. So there were a number of them who, they weren't trying to change me or anything. We just get together and talk about different things. They would ask questions that the theological tradition that I had been educated in just never asked. And I was kind of coming out of I was enamored for a period of time with kind of progressive sort of the progressive wing of the evangelical world. Tom Sine, Tony Campolo, Jim Wallace, those guys. And I began to dabble a bit in, liberation theology, particularly the pedagogical side of it, with people like, Paulo Freire and those guys. And so I was intrigued by all this stuff because the theological tradition I had been, formed by, was not asking questions concerning politics or economics. And these lefties who ostensibly had an interest in, helping the poor were asking those questions. Obviously, they were drawing on Marxist analysis and stuff like that to do that. And I was actually a card-carrying member of the Marxist Center for Education in Cambridge for a little while. So I'm probably on some government list of people to watch. I turned away from all that though, because I just, the combination of my own sort of experience with, government welfare, again, it was like,
you were in the foster care systems. You experienced it firsthand.
Right. So I didn't have any of the middle class guilt or any of the sort of the haze that you look through when you're looking into things from, a cul-de-sac in Pasadena or something like that. It was like, I know exactly what it's like. It's like being raised by the Department of Motor Vehicles. It's just like that. If you can imagine what that's like. So I had no affection for it. But so I was looking for alternatives, and the reform guys would say, the Bible can help us think about politics. The Bible can help us think about economics. I was like, more in a deeper way than the folks that I had been looking to on the evangelical left would say was possible. So anyway, that was helpful, and so I ended up meeting people like Harvey Kahn down at Westminster. I actually wrote for him for a little bit for his journal Urban Mission, and
well, he was like Tim Keller's mentor, right?
Yeah. In fact, I know people who knew Keller when he was there, and they're like just as puzzled as can be how he ever became the big deal he is. But anyway, so they're like, I know that guy. He wasn't that great. But anyway, I'm not saying anything. I'm not casting aspersions on Keller, but he was just another guy in that sort of world at that time.
Just another seminary professor.
Right.
Yeah. It's I could go on and on and on talking about your life, because I think it's just so fascinating. You don't meet a lot of Presbyterian pastors with this kind of a background. This is like, so I get it. People tune in for this. But I got to ask one more question about you.
Sure.
It's immediately prompted by what you're saying, because we didn't talk about it. We knew how you kind of came to be a Christian in high school, and you ended up doing urban ministry in Boston. How did you make the switch from like, I'm a Christian to now I want to be in ministry?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I didn't want to be in ministry, to be honest with you. I fought it. I had a dream of being a comic book artist. So, I've got, family in the arts, and even as a kid, I showed some promise, and I was in art programs, and so that was my passion. That was my dream. And so that was what I wanted to do. And not long after I became a Christian, I just felt a sense that maybe, Christian ministry was the thing I should do. Now, I was in a denomination that really thought about the world in the way that I think Reformed people try to discourage people from thinking about things. I was in a world where if you're a really serious Christian, then you go into full-time Christian ministry. You're a missionary or pastor, that kind of thing. And then there are all the other people out there who just kind of live ordinary lives and support you. So they're kind of like second-class Christians, I guess, or something like that. Now, the Reformed, of course, everyone has a vocation, and perhaps if I had in those days, Reformed teaching, I might have tried to find a way to justify my interest in being a comic book artist as my calling, and I believe that there are people out there like Doug TenNapel and stuff like that, guys like him who do that as their calling, and I'm all for it. But I think that. For me, in God's providence, I was where I was, and it was a struggle. I didn't want to go into ministry, and then when I did eventually concede, or sort of like throw up my hands and say I give up, I'll do it. Then it occurred to me that I've got this weird background. I've grown up in projects. I've known people from lots of sort of a range of backgrounds. And so, and just in terms of personal experience, I think maybe I'm cut out to do urban work because of those experiences. And I enjoyed my years in urban ministry, about a decade there in the Boston area. I've got a lot of fond memories and lots of friendships that I made. So I don't regret any of it, but I did come to see that I was also sort of called a sort of like a larger set of things, or
Hmm.
maybe that's not the right way to put it, but I think you get my drift.
Right. So when you engage with the people who are doing urban ministry today, or you see them, so you're not intimidated by the thought of like engage because you've done it. I mean,
Right.
you say I've done this before, so I have my own thoughts on it.
Yeah, I've been mugged. I've been in the midst of a huge gang fight. I've got all kinds of stories I could tell.
Yeah, because if somebody met you and like just had an ordinary conversation with you, they'd never think that all this stuff happened because it's not at all your personality or yeah, unstable, for example, is not a word I would ever think that.
Well, the fun thing is I can pretty much tell right off, real early whether or not that kind of that stuff in my life that I experienced will be something that the person I'm meeting can relate to. And so, if I get a sense that they would never be able to even know what I'm talking about if I get into that stuff, I don't go there. But oftentimes there are people. For example, you lived in New York City for years, and you've got a wide range of experiences in terms of people you've dealt with. And so there's stuff that I could say, Aaron would be able to kind of relate to this.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of folks that I just don't go there.
Mm-hmm. So the household, your book, Man of the
Yeah.
House. What is the basic thesis of that book in terms of what I should be doing if I want to be the man of the house?
Right. Well, I think the basic thesis is that when the Industrial Revolution essentially transformed our households from productive enterprises into recreation centers, men were sort of one of the obvious sort of victims of that. And I think the reason that's so is because with the Industrial Revolution, the relationships, the connections that men had to their wives and their children went from being things that you know they were engaged with, or people they were engaged with just in the daily course of life, because the productive work that a man performed was in proximity to his wife and children, to an experience for the vast majority of men where they were, they went someplace else, and because of that, the relationships they had with their wives and children were compromised at a kind of fundamental level. Everything went from being sort of, well, we're here together and we're working together, to, okay, I'm not doing anything important now, but I am around my kids, or I'm with my wife. Now, obviously those things are important, but we had to sort of find a new way to justify them. And the way we justified them was, as I noted, kind of psychologizing them, or turning everything into pedagogy, so that we could raise our kids to be productive somewhere else, not around the house. So it affected a man's standing with his family. It affected his role with his wife and children. I think it compromised his authority in the home. And I think for all these reasons, a lot of men are like, well, if I want to do something important, I need to do it someplace else. And they're not really sure how a household relates to that. So one of the things I wanted to do with Man of the House in particular was show men that they could think about their households in a way that they're not being encouraged to think about them. And if they did so, they would be much more sort of pro-household, pro-family than they generally are. I think many men can be pro-children, pro-wife, pro-marriage, and all that kind of stuff. But it's sort of like an add-on to their vocation. Whereas if they think about households as productive enterprises, then it's all integrated. Everything kind of works together, or at least ideally.
I think about your kind of average American man today, and my impression is he's married, he's got kids, but the home is sort of his wife's domain.
Okay.
She decorated it. She's kind of running the show there. Maybe he's got a workshop out in his garage where he tinkers on things, or he's got a man cave. Maybe he's got a place. He's got his own little place, just like kids have their room,
That's right.
where he's allowed to have his stuff.
That's right.
But
That's right.
and then he comes
Right.
home. He comes home from work, and he's like tired, and he's
Sure.
just wants to crack open a beer and decompress. Doesn't necessarily want to have all this engagement. For like, I just want to like chill out.
Right.
And so I mean, again, maybe that's unfair. That's just like the stereotype, but it's not super appealing. I think in a lot of ways,
Right.
for that. And when you say productive, when you say making households productive again, which I think is really, I mean, I would say in essence somewhat the core of the book is we need to think of our homes, our household as a place of production, not just a place of consumption and companionship. Are we talking about starting a home-based business, or what are we talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can include that, but I don't think it is exhausted by that. I think, there are two ways we could think about productive households, or at least two ways. One was we can think about sort of how they are oriented toward the market, and then we can think about them as subsistence economies. So when you think about a subsistence economy, the things that you're doing that are productive are intended to serve just your own house, and they're not measured in dollars. You don't evaluate them that way, the things that you're doing. So, I think one area or a couple of areas, particularly in this whole matter of sort of social welfare, where we see households making actually a strong comeback right now, are with homeschooling and with elder care. So there are different reasons why those things have developed. Those sort of, you could say a revival of the subsistence economy in the household with regard to those matters. But those are definitely productive things. Educating your children at home, caring for your parents, at home, or at least being connected with them and caring for them as they grow older. The stuff that you do for the market, that's more challenging because that's where you are actually in competition, I think, in certain ways with institutions that you really can't beat. So, you got to figure out ways to kind of work kind of alongside them, or, so for example, you might be a guy who writes code. You're tech guy. And you might even be able to, start a small software firm with a few people that work with you. But it's Microsoft that has created the environment within which you work, right? So, they've created this large. So even for you to have this small company, you need a Goliath to already have created the environment within which you can work. So which means that some people are going to have to work for Goliath, in order for that environment to exist. So there are certain challenges to developing productive property in the current environment. But I think that far more people can own productive property than perhaps we've been led to believe. But productive property is the thing. Productive property is something that you own that can give you a living, and that, as I noted, can include a wide range of things.
Well, I think you talk about like the land the farmer owns that he grows the crops on, or things like that.
Yeah, that would certainly be one example of it. Business would be another example. Real estate would be another. Intellectual property. All these things take a lot of work to develop, and there are ways in which your wife and children can work with you, with them, depending on what you're doing. For example, intellectual property is something that I've been developing for a while, but also I have real estate, and my wife has a piano teaching business that she has. So within our home, we have a range of properties that we own, and our kids actually help us with them.
Mm-hmm. I got a really interesting question here from Lance. and he talks about some of the barriers to household, just looking specifically at making money around homeowners associations and legal codes and things like that. Have you run into that? Do you have any thoughts on? Because a lot of people do now live in developments, suburban developments that have HOAs. You can't even paint your house, like a color they
Right.
don't say. It's essentially like living in an apartment that you own.
Right. Yeah, I think that is true. And what you have in a situation like that is people who really have bought completely into the whole recreational household model. This is a place where you go at the end of the day, and no one's supposed to be engaged in anything productive at home. That's zoned for someplace else. I think that there are certain parts of the country, though, that oddly enough, are more friendly precisely because they're more liberal. I know that that might sound strange. So here I am. I'm in Battleground, Washington, right now. So I went from Connecticut to the state of Washington recently, and the condominium that I live in right now has a first floor storefront, and then we live above it, just like people did back in Baltimore and Boston and New York City back in the day. So they intentionally developed a community with the old model in mind. So this is a new urbanist environment that I'm in now, and it's very much the intention is that you should be able to do productive things from home. You should be able to have a business at home. So right now, my wife is teaching piano via Zoom to kids back on the East Coast in,
Wow.
at the piano that's in our office downstairs. So I've got that's one reason I'm not in the office right now. She's down there using the office to teach piano. But so there are environments where that's the case. But I do think that our physical structures reflect our purposes or the things we want to do in them. So form does follow function. And one of the reasons why we have cul-de-sacs and sort of zoning the way that we do today is because the only function that households have had for the last 100, 150 years or so for many people is a place to get away from work. But I think that that's changing. I think that the coronavirus thing, the pandemic has kind of been sort of like throwing a little bit of gasoline on the fire, but the fire has been going for a little while, and more people have been working from home. And I really do think that there's an opportunity for, architects and people who were in construction, renovation people, sort of to develop physical structures, households that reincorporate things that had been outsourced in the past. Maybe that means, spaces that can be sort of multi-use. Maybe it means, every home should really have an office, not just a third bedroom that's been converted into one, with a separate entrance and maybe even separate parking and all of that. But I do think that there are some healthy trends in our society and our physical structures can and should be altered in order to make sort of this revival of. And by the way, I really do think this is the beginning of a revival, because everywhere I go, and when I talk about these themes, whether I'm talking to highly educated people, blue collar people, men, women, mothers, whatever, they're all like, of course, this is the way our ancestors lived. We need to kind of get back, at least in some way, get closer to it. We obviously can't go back, but we can adapt.
Right. I do think there's something about this household economy in the zeitgeist right now. A lot of people are talking about it. It'll be interesting to see what happens with it. Like the 70s, and they had the Back to the Land movement.
Right.
And people were going to go back, and it just fizzled out, right? It fizzled out. Right. So it's challenging. I think one of the most challenging things that we have to do, and what we all have to figure out, is how to maintain a healthy and humane existence inside of industrial society, which is just so different from how humans had lived at any point in the past. I know we like to think about like political systems, democracy, autocracy, but in essence, this is what I do think the Marxists have something to write on this is like the economic system restructures the whole of society
Right.
around it. There may not be a dictatorship of the proletariat, but certainly the economic structure of society, it has a pervasive influence on how people live, and you end up at the point where you cannot opt out of the system. It's easy to say, like right now, it's easy to say, well, I just won't have a smartphone if I don't want to be tracked. Well, I mean, in essence, you almost have to have a smartphone today. So I work in the co-working facility I work in. It's keyless entrance with a phone app.
Okay.
I can't get in here.
Right,
I do
right.
think I do think they now have like one door with like a fingerprint on it. But think about that. We're like literally, if you don't have a smartphone today, you can't do anything. You go to a restaurant now, they don't have a menu. They got a QR code you're supposed to scan. Like
Right.
essentially, the idea that you will be able to opt out of having this surveillance device in your pocket is just at some point, not that anybody's doing it today, but it's going to become almost impossible to do. And so it says, one of the things that I would say, think about productive, and I'm interested in your take on it, is there's almost this idea that everybody today needs to be an entrepreneur. And like among millennials, it's like you gotta have your side hustle, for example. I gotta have a side hustle. And I'm self-employed, so I've worked in corporate America, which I'm under no illusions about the nature of corporate America. But there's a lot of great things that I have about corporate America, and I know the virtues of this. But like, I think that most people, quite frankly, are not suited to entrepreneurship psychologically or in life. And as I say, when you think about like pre-industrial society, it was subsistence. It was not running a home business. Right, even if you have a little organic farm selling cash crops, that's very different than it was before. How do you get involved in this productive property business for people who don't seem to have a psychological orientation towards entrepreneurship, or is that just a muscle that people have to develop?
Well, I think you're onto something. As I've traveled and spoken on this subject, I've come across a lot of guys who kind of anticipated my thinking and actually started businesses that have been pretty successful. Talking about businesses that are maybe $30 to $80 million, annual. Maybe they have a dozen to 50 employees, and they're kind of wondering, okay, I did this, but I can see a lot of the people who work for me just probably can't, and many of them don't even want to try. So how do I relate to that? So I'm not entirely satisfied with my own thinking on that at this point. I do think there is a muscle that many of us have that is underdeveloped, and it has to do with kind of our ability to take risk, to see value, those sorts of things. But that doesn't mean that everybody can be an entrepreneur. I think that with regard to the side hustle stuff, I think we're kind of seeing a pendulum that has swung to a different point. So like when I was a kid in the 70s even, people still talked about safe, secure jobs with benefits. No one believes in that anymore. I remember my father-in-law, who had been an engineer with Hamilton Standard for about 30 years, was laid off in the early 90s, and it just completely devastated him. He was like one of the very first waves of this sort of outsourcing and sort of offshoring phenomena that went. Then he became a consultant and was hired back without the benefits at a lower rate. So he ended up still working for United Technologies. It was a great deal for the corporation. It was a really bad deal for him. But I think that's where a lot of people are now. They're just like, I just don't think I can trust big corp. I've got friends who have been laid off from well-known high-tech companies simply because they weren't willing to sign on with all the stuff with wokeness and so forth, and are now entrepreneurs mm-hmm. because they might prefer to be back with big corp, but they're just not there anymore because they can't reconcile their conscience with what they're being asked to do. So I do think a lot of people are being forced into stuff, and I think that's healthy. But realistically, your point, I agree with. Not everybody's cut out for this, at least for being an entrepreneur. But I do think that there are ways to still pursue and acquire productive property. And even when you're not doing things for the market, you can still do things in sort of the subsistence model. With there are just things that you can do for your as a family, as a household, that are worth doing and enrich your life and provide sort of activities that everybody can work together to bring about or to achieve, or the goal or whatever.
I think you're onto something there with this idea that we can, at least if we can't be entrepreneurs, the flip side of that is we can start doing things for ourselves that we're paying other people to do.
Right.
And so in essence, I don't know if we're making money per se that way, but going back to, and that is one of the things I'm very cognizant of, because, if I go back to the 1980s when I was in high school growing up, what are some characteristics of that era that I recall? And this isn't just true of like us because we didn't have a lot of money. It was true of like most people. One, you didn't eat out a lot. You didn't have this like constant going out to eat. People ate mostly at home. I don't think my mother or people of her generation, many of them ever had like a manicure in a nail salon. They were just, they were doing their own nails if somebody were doing their nails.
Right,
People cut their own grass, and if you were paying somebody to cut your grass, it was like the neighborhood teenager who was trying to make some money.
Right.
Almost nobody had a maid or a cleaning service. Everybody was cleaning their own house.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things. Now, one of the things that I notice, everything today is outsourced. People pay other people to do everything. And in general, certainly the upper middle class do this. And one of the things that, I really became much more cognizant of is how this is really only enabled because of, in essence, labor exploitation. So a lot of these things are now being done by either immigrants or illegal immigrants who are being paid very little money, no benefits. Often they're not getting, like all these people in New York. It's like on the Upper West Side, these are like people who make good incomes, but New York's so expensive. It's all their nannies are immigrants, like 95% of them. Now, I'm sure that, like, again, the genuinely rich people, have the, govern us with a master's degree or whatever. But they're hiring immigrant nannies. They're almost all paying under the table, so they're not contributing to Social Security. There's no benefits. There's no unemployment. And it's just labor exploitation. And those people are being, kept away from their own kids in some cases. Yeah. And so I've really made an effort to stop outsourcing. I don't even know if it's, maybe at some point you can make the argument that, to get that time back in your life is more valuable than the amount of money that you're saving. I think there is an argument to make about that, a purely utilitarian economic argument. But I think there's something about saying that we don't actually just outsource a whole life to other people.
Right. I'm familiar with Matthew Crawford's book, Shop Class of Soulcraft.
I know it, but I haven't read it.
It's a marvelous book. He's an interesting character that I kind of identify with. And you could say he grew up in Berkeley. His parents were kind of hippie folk. And but anyway, he because he was in this sort of super cerebral bohemian environment, he kind of rebelled by getting involved with becoming an electrician and a car mechanic. And he eventually went on to earn his PhD in political philosophy at University of Chicago. But he's still a motorcycle mechanic today, and still is a licensed electrician, I believe. But one of the things that he said in that book that I found really useful is this idea that people use the term opportunity cost in order to outsource. So they use this as a rationale. They say, well, if I could save some time, by not cutting my own lawn and having it done by somebody else, then that'll give me more time for the things that I'm really good at and can be more productive. But his point is that these things aren't entirely fungible. That when you keep outsourcing stuff, you're essentially you're impoverishing yourself in ways you don't even know you're doing. And I remember kind of coming out of the sort of this bohemia of intellectuals and artists and stuff where people really didn't know how to do anything,
Hmm.
practically speaking, into this Western Pennsylvania world where a guy, I'm talking about guys who could hunt, could pull an engine from their car, could repair, their plumbing, could do everything.
Hmm.
Some people, I back in the trades, and people kind of look at me with awe and say, "Man, you can do a lot of stuff." And I say, "I can't do anything compared to the guys I knew when I was a kid."
Hmm.
those were guys who were really good at stuff. I'm just, I'm like a midget compared to those guys. But I do think that this whole matter of having some range and having a range of skills and also competencies and agency in a wide range of things is very enriching. And one of the ways that you develop those things is by doing things for yourself. Trying, obviously, when you start, it's going to be crude. You're going to be unhappy with your results, but you get better by practice.
Hmm. Yeah, I just think there's something, about this. There is this something about this idea that, we don't do anything for ourselves anymore. We don't even raise our kids anymore.
Yeah.
Really, the thing that gets me is, people in New York City, they've got, 1-year-olds in classes. Everything is classes. It's like your job as the parent is an orchestrator. You're basically an
Right.
orchestrator. You select and curate the activities that your child is in, and then you kind of just pay for them and shuttle them around. And of course, you're doing things with your child that you're playing with them. You're not just like not paying attention to
Sure.
them, but there is
Sure.
a sense in which you're relying on professionals to raise your child in every way, and that's
Yeah, I remember getting on my bike, my Schwinn Stingray, and heading out and no one knowing where I was for hours, and going down to the park and playing baseball or basketball and just jumping my bike and doing stuff like that. And with that kind of, now obviously that's I got into trouble. I did things I shouldn't do. I hurt myself, but it was through that sort of kind of going out and doing stuff without supervision that I learned a lot of things. And I think that perhaps this is one of the reasons why we have people who just arrive at adulthood and are incompetent when it comes to a wide range of stuff.
yeah. There's been there's all this literature on you need unstructured playtime. Kids need to self organize their activities and solve their own disputes and things like that. And I think sometimes it's just I just don't think this is like new. This idea that I've got this army of servants basically,
Right.
taking care of various aspects of my kid's life. But again, I think there's a lot of kind of conundrums I think that come with this. Ivan Illich wrote about this a lot. He's like,
Oh yeah.
we've sort of had this inversion where it used to be the poor people who gave birth at home. It was the poor people who had to kind of grow their own food. It was the poor people who had to build their own little shack out back. Well, now it's the rich people who do all that. And
Right.
so if you have to essentially be wealthy or have a certain amount of means in order to insulate yourselves from the worst effects of industrial economy. And so it's like, yes, I will do all these things, and yet it seems like, in a lot of ways, the people who do them are people at the upper end of the spectrum. So is this a is it a money issue, or is it how do we explain this, and how do we help average people start detaching themselves from some of the most destructive effects of the market?
Yeah, I think the place to begin is just with the change in outlook, a mindset change. One of the things that I've been really pleased to see over the past few years is as people have responded to the things I've written, it's not so much that there's some kind of checklist that I've given them. You do this, this, and this, and this, and then everything is going to work out in this way. It's been more of a sort of a frame of reference, helping people think about life differently. And I think that people are far more capable and creative than they're often given credit for being. And I'm always surprised at the stuff that people write to me about and tell me that they're trying or doing. So I think the place to begin is with this idea that, hey, I want to have more agency in my life. I want to be able to work with my wife and children in practical ways that will enrich us all, and provide, obviously occasions for fellowship and for interaction, but also something that we can look at and say, hey, that was something we did together. We're actually capable of taking care of ourselves in ways we didn't think we could, in a wide range of things. So I think it begins with sort of a way of seeing the world that people are discouraged from adopting today, and I hope that more and more people can and will adopt. And I think that in the past, like you noted, poor people had to do it, and now it's sort of a boutique thing where only wealthy people seem to be able to do some of this stuff. And I would like to see it become more broadly the case, for everybody.
Yeah, it does seem like, we've a lot of things like cheap TVs and things like that. The flat screen TVs was a canonical example. They used to cost thousands of dollars. Now, you can buy one for like $100, right? So it started out as a luxury item, and then it kind of came down until now it's the only item. But some things don't seem to be trickling down. Organic. I don't like the term organic food because I'm not really into organic per se. But like this idea of like, fresh food, non-industrialized food. It doesn't seem to quite be trickling down as much. Or maybe I'm wrong. That's one that I'm really interested in figuring out how to get people eating better. How can we not eat, massive bags of potato chips and stuff like that for every meal?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think like my wife, her grandparents were from Sicily, right off the boat. And I remember when I first, dated her, we would go over to her grandmother's house for Sunday dinner, and everything was fresh and homemade. She had this enormous garden. She was this little Italian lady with the enormous garden. It's like right out of the movies. And she had like maybe an 8th grade education. She was doing organic gardening and had no idea that it was like a cool thing. Like she made her own clothes, all this kind of stuff. But now my daughter, who is, very educated and it's, is very sort of like a high-end foodie kind of person. She would actually have more to talk about with her great-grandmother than she might have to talk about with her grandmother. So there's an interesting kind of Hanson's Law kind of thing going on, return to the 3rd or 4th generation.
Yeah, well, this idea of like, that's another one, making your own clothes. Even when I was, I'm not that, I'm 51, but, when I was in high school, you go to like a regular store, they would be selling patterns for making clothing, and people had sewing machines and they bought fabric and made stuff. Like again, now it's a specialty thing for rich people to do. Like, now I'm into knitting or something like that because I'm like, it was like,
right, yeah. I hear you. Yeah, in fact, my daughter, who I said is a really great baker, all she needs to do is say on social media, "I'm coming home from college," and she'll have 6 days worth of orders for scones and different things. And so she's in the kitchen the whole time. Now, on one way, it's great, because she's earning some money. But on the other hand, why do all these people need her to do their baking for them?
Right. Well, I'll give my own tip for what we do, and then we'll move on to your other book. One of the things that I said in New York was, when my wife and I we want to live differently than other people live. Not to necessarily just to be consciously different, although probably if I psychologically examine myself, there probably is some of that. I want to be a little bit, I don't want to be too much in the mainstream. But, this idea that there is sort of an unhealthy pattern of living in some of these cities. And like, how can we live a different pattern? And then I always loved it. We would just invite people over for dinner at our apartment. And so we can invite people into that world and show people that it's possible to live a different way. Maybe hopefully a healthier way that other people are living. And so I think just hospitality of just cooking a meal for someone or something like that and inviting people into your world is like one of the ways that we can be. Hospitality is a form of productivity.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think
definitely.
in an important way.
Yeah, that's hugely important. Yeah.
So your other book on this topic is The Household and the War for the Cosmos. So what is the cosmological significance of the household?
Yeah, the first book, Man of the House, was more of kind of like a how to do it kind of hands-on book, or at least that's what I aspired to when I wrote it. The second book was sort of a justification at the highest level for it, so that you know, in order to make a household work, you have to make sacrifices and things that can be very challenging, uh, and it's tempting to quit. Now, in the past, people didn't quit because there was like no plan B. So like why I can't quit, I'll die.
Hmm.
There's no corporation or anything like that somebody can hire me to keep me going. But today, there is the option of the sort of the one person household, or whatever. So what I wanted to do is sort of connect or help people see the connection between our households and household of God, not just simply the household of God in terms of the church as we know it today, but in terms of the household in terms of the kingdom of God. So, kingdom is it's a territory, whether we're talking about spiritual territory or physical territory, where there is a ruling house. That's what a king and a queen are, right? A husband and wife.
Hmm.
And then you got the princes and the princesses, their children, and so forth. But they are the ruling house. So when we think about the kingdom of God, we think about the bride of Christ, the church, and we think about the bridegroom, Christ. We're talking about a household that is eschatological in character, the end of the world. And so that's the new cosmos. Cosmos means order in Greek. We normally think about it today in terms of outer space because of Carl Sagan and people like him. But in the ancient world, it was just simply the order at the largest level. And there's a kind of mimesis, there's a mimicry in which the ancients understood their own particular households as being a kind of small version of the macro household.
That like fractal pattern there, you might say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think fractals are kind of the mathematical rediscovery of this whole way of thinking. But if you go to the Romans, you go to the Greeks, you go to the Chinese, you go to the Hebrews, they all thought in this way. There are parallels. The thing that they disagreed about was the large order, who's in charge, who's on the top.
Mm.
That's what they disagreed about. But they agreed that households should be small versions of the macro household. So that's what the household and the war for the cosmos is about. How our households reflect and retell the story of the largest household of all, and the last household, meaning last in terms of like where it's all heading,
Hmm.
eschatologically.
So you would view that the household as a microcosm or a microcosmos of something bigger.
That's exactly right, and that's, I think, the argument that Paul is making in with the household codes, and particularly in Ephesians, that he's making that point. And it would have been sort of second nature for those folks. We tend to miss it because we don't think in those terms today. We think of the cosmos as just this big machine, and we think of our homes as sort of these psychological little, I guess, bubbles sort of floating in this big machine. But that's not the way the ancients thought about it.
So is there a transcendent purpose in the household then?
That's exactly the point. Yeah, I wanted to help people see the transcendent purpose, because if you don't have that transcendent purpose, you could easily just give up. You could just say, "Why try? I mean, this is too hard." But if your household is participating in something, really, ultimate, uh, in some way reflecting ultimate concerns and truths, then you make the sacrifices not just to survive, but to sort of live in the light of ultimate truth.
I think it's interesting that you say that in light of our previous conversation about your background, because if you think about it, certainly in the post Enlightenment era, it has really been. I think conservatives have tended to valorize bourgeois life,
Yeah.
So this idea of especially the petite bourgeoisie, right? The small little shopkeeper, the small home, these the little platoons, all these people, but it's essentially a materialist vision. Petty concerns, consumerist concerns, survival concerns,
Right.
and the left has really been the ones that have critiqued that. They've always had incredible hostility to sort of the bourgeois class, the middle class. You can even think about I think about the novels of Sinclair Lewis, for example, just the deep hostility that people have. And I think you don't have to go along with their philosophies to see that this idea that the way conservatives in a modern American sense have conceived of the household is really there's nothing transcendent about it. It's
Right.
pathetic and petty material concerns are the locomotive of society. They're what we should valorize, what we should thing. And so I think this is one of the many things that should be rethought about how we perceive the nature of household life, which has sort of been flattened out in modern society.
Yeah, I think that, members of a household, if they can see how their roles uh, correspond to these very sort of ennobling themes, then it enriches the understanding of those people. So they're not just simply playing sort of like they're not just simply cogs in a machine. They're actually actors who are, in some sense, embodying transcendent realities. And with that in mind, it gives you, sort of an added basis or sort of an extra, I guess, sort of inspiration to put up with, your the sort of the challenges that come from caring for like an aged parent who's losing his memory or something like that. You can get kind of lost in sort of the mundane, and lose sight of how this thing that you're doing is actually something really important in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, it's just something we don't even think about it at all. I mean, again, the vision of the household, I think, in a lot of ways, is kind of a purely materialistic one. And another thing that you talk about and kind of this a little bit of a transcendent regard is the intergenerational nature of the household because I left home when I was 18, and I think it's very common in that era that the idea was you raise your kids and they get to be 18, they graduate from high school, whatever, and they're gone. They better be out, right? Or we're gonna start charging you rent. We're always there. And now it's like we mock people because they're still living at home with mom at age 30. And I don't want to defend the video gamers and the people who are just of that, but I do think there's something of this idea. I think about this a lot is the household is a multi generational enterprise, not just a not just have the birds kick the little birdies out of the nest, at some point, and then they're on their own. How do we think about that, or should we think about that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts. One is the church I have just begun to serve here in Washington has done I think a really good job of kind of sort of encouraging families to do sort of the intergenerational thing. So I currently serve a church that has a number of families that have a lot of kids, and the kids have all kind of settled in the immediate area, or many of them have, and they're engaged in lots of productive activity. But there's just an ongoing kind of intergenerational connection that occurs, and is mutually enriching in just about every way you can imagine it. Now that's possible because there's located, many of these people are, the two or three generations now are located in the same physical area. It's obviously a lot more difficult if you're not. Now, the situation that I'm in right now is my oldest son and his wife live in Nashville. My second son and his wife live in Connecticut. My daughter's in college, and my wife and I live here in Washington, and my wife's mother is back in Connecticut. So, here I am, Mr. Household Intergeneration guy, and we're all over the place, right? Well, one of the things that I've been trying to do is make sure that we maintain connections in a range of ways, and one of those ways is through economic activity. So my sons actually work with me on different things that we're doing together. So my oldest son, he's an audio tech guy, and he's actually the audio production guy for our podcast, the Theology Podcast. And so I'm interacting with him every week. And then my second son is actually managing our real estate investment properties back in Connecticut. So I'm interacting with him almost every week about stuff related to that. Now, is that ideal? No, I'd much rather have us all in the same area. But maybe that can happen someday. But I'm working at ways, and I do think this is where the technology can be helpful in maintaining those connections. And my daughter is now out here with us for a week, and I'm talking to her about something that she can do in terms of one of the businesses that we have to help out. So anyway, not the way I think I would like to see it work, but I'm still working at it.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken like a slightly different point of view than maybe I had for myself, and we'll see how my son feels about it. I have a 3.5-year-old son. So, I couldn't wait to get out of the house and be off on my own and be independent. And maybe he'll be that way too. But I do think, although I think we like to make fun of the helicopter parenting and the snowplow parenting and all that, the idea that your parents are intimately involved in advancing the fortunes of the children, I think is actually a healthy thing to some extent. I really do think that, like, this idea, I'm going to help you get launched in life, et cetera, particularly today when we live so much longer. So we actually have our
Right.
parents with us perhaps much longer than we would have in the past. So I certainly see, helping my parents along, and kind of their old, as they get older, isn't something that I want to do. But I also think, wait, man, how do I endow my son with everything that he needs to succeed and thrive in life? Not just to get him till he's 18 and get him through college, but to think about how do we advance the ball there. And
Right.
I think it's kind of rare. It used to be that like the son would go into the father's trade, into the father's business, might even work with the father in his business and eventually take it over. And you don't see that as much today. As I say, the two fields you see it a lot in are politics
Yeah.
and the ministry. Where
Right.
you often
Right.
see the son take over the father's pulpit, or
Right.
somehow get involved in the family business. And people love to complain about nepotism and this and that, but I think there's I think there's actually something healthy about it. That's why I'm not actually that sympathetic to nepotism concerns, as long as you're not claiming you have a meritocracy or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I give a problem is when we're claiming we're running a meritocracy in America, which I always say, look, we have nothing remotely resembling a meritocracy here. But I do. There's like when you start thinking about what am I creating that will then be bequeathed to my children and to them, assets that they can steward, that they can take on, that allow their span of influence in the world, hopefully for the sake of advancing the kingdom of God, to be greater than it would have been if they were basically had to build everything from scratch. If every generation is starting from scratch again, that's not good.
Yeah, I agree. And as I'm thinking about it, just as you just described, things, it occurred to me that my sons are working with me on two of our properties. One is our real estate, and the other is our intellectual property. So they're going to inherit those. So they're working on things that they're going to be receiving. And hopefully will have grown in value by the time I'm gone, and can be helpful to them in their own endeavors with their children. I also helped in both cases with my sons on buying their houses. So they both I've got background in real estate and construction and so forth. So I was able to help them out, and so now my oldest son is 28 and my second son is going to be 24 next month. And they both own homes and are married. And
That's
so
great.
yeah, so I'm very pleased with how they've done. But yeah, I've been involved with them pretty closely in those things.
Yeah. maybe the most controversial thing I actually read in your book was you're like an advocate for primogeniture,
Yeah, sure.
or talk about it, or bring it up, or say it's not a bad thing. Is that? Do you really believe in that?
Well, I think that
How does your younger son feel about that? Let's just,
yeah, I think you need to modify it. But I do think that the argument for it is you don't want to cut up the steak into too many pieces. That there's a certain sense in which, in order for an asset to make to bring the kind of returns that you want it to bring, it has to have matured. And when you take something and with every generation cut it up into smaller bits, then you end up actually not taking say let's say with regard to my kids, something that's worth $100,000, and now they each get 33,000 whatever. You actually, in terms of when you cut it up, you actually take them further down than that, because for a range of reasons. One of those obviously being taxation, but another reason being that you really have to be kind of at a particular size before you can see certain kinds of returns. So I think that one way to handle this, and I've been talking to some people about it, is with LLCs. So I think an LLC is an institution that can hold property and divide up interest in a property, but still have someone who manages as the head of the the entity, the corporation. And so primogeniture in that respect would mean that you maybe have a managing member who would be one particular child, but then you have a range of of ownership and percentages of ownership by other people, so that you could have distribution of ownership and income that way. But this is stuff that I'm not really prepared to talk about too much, because I'm still kind of thinking through it myself.
yeah, what you often see is if there's like a large privately held business that a family owns, the heirs each get their share in it, but they can't agree on how to manage the business or how to run the business. And so what happens is you end up selling off the businesses and distributing the assets.
Right.
And so, I grew up in Louisville, where the Bingham family owned the local newspaper, the Courier Journal, and they sold it off. Now, probably a good thing to have sold off the newspaper, but that's a strategic asset to be able to do that. And so you look at the Sulzberger family, the Sulzberger Ox family that has owned the New York Times since the 1800s. Their ability to intergenerationally keep that asset not totally owned by them, but certainly voting control within their family, they understand the value of the New York Times. They can't allow it. Whereas the Bancroft family sold off the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And so, that becomes one where you get these situations where you end up liquidating an asset that has a value that is not strictly economic. So I think if you think about a portfolio that you've acquired in a certain neighborhood in a certain city, there's a strategic value to that portfolio above and beyond the purely economic value of the assets. It lets you be, a force for good,
Yeah.
and a force of stability, to be like a good landlord as opposed to a bad landlord. And so it's easier to split up property empires. But I do think this idea that when you force, when you force businesses, family businesses, and things like that to be liquidated. This maybe doesn't apply to every business, but a lot of businesses have strategic value for the family, for the kingdom, for a lot of things, and you lose that if you're forced to sell off.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think, it would be a worthwhile study. Maybe this has already been done. It would be worthwhile looking at those families that have been able to retain ownership over generations within a family, and say, how did that occur? I suspect that in part it had to do with the fact that the members of the family understood that they were a part of something bigger than themselves, and that it was worthwhile working together and compromising, doing the things you needed to do in order to keep the asset intact. Otherwise,
Yep.
Something precious is lost.
It seems to be more in Europe that you've seen these multi-generational, or Japan or places like that. One of the things about the United States is when the estate tax came along, and a lot of these different rule changes came along, it encouraged people to place their assets in trusts and other vehicles to avoid taxation. And that often has negative effects because then it has to be administered on like a fiduciary basis, and all these different things. And I do think there's something about this idea of trying to tax minimization strategies. I think have driven estate planning far more than anything else, and it's had a lot of negative consequences. One of the most famous examples was John D. MacArthur, who was the creator of the MacArthur Foundation, was a very apparently not a very good man. I don't know that much about him, but I know he was very conservative. He's like, I'm not going to let the government get my money when I die. So he put it all into a foundation so that they wouldn't be able to tax it. But he didn't really set up any controls or anything. He put no restrictions on the money. So now it's like one of the most far left foundations in the country run by this guy. And a lot of these foundations are like that. They were established by people who are much more conservative. And now you actually have strategic assets that are controlled by people whose values are antithetical to yours. But we're getting maybe into financial planning, but I do think there's something about we have to rethink, maybe tax minimization and things like that, or there's a lot of things we could rethink about how to do these things, or thinking about keeping assets intact. And if it comes from having a multi-generational perspective, which I think, and I think about this more as I'm reaching my age now, where, you finally reach the point in life where you realize, hey, I'm not going to see how X, Y, or Z is going to turn out in this world. I'm going to be gone before I really see how this turns out. And how do you think about your impact, or enabling your children to have an impact after you're gone is very important consideration.
Yeah. The book, Man of the House, was originally commissioned to be written for the Herder Publishing concern out of Germany, which is, I believe, the oldest family-held publisher in the world. I think 7 generations.
Wow.
They're like they published the Pope, the Dalai Lama, and folks like that. And I was actually under contract with them to publish Man of the House. But my editor there, you probably know who he is, so I won't mention his name. But my editor there had a falling out with Gwendolyn Herder, who was the head of the American branch of the publishing concern. It's Crossroads Press, and so I became suddenly leprous. And she brought in an editor from Berkeley, a guy who wanted me to rewrite the book and turn it into like Chicken Soup for the Soul for Men or something like that. And so I decided not to do that. I'm glad I didn't, but that's why it wasn't published by them. I actually got out of the contract. But being introduced to that world was fascinating, kind of, just sort of like learning a little bit about how, that family managed to retain, ownership over a profitable concern for 7 generations was amazing to me.
Yeah, that is amazing. It's not something we think about these days, and that's a legacy. Well, Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me today. Again, thank you, everyone. The books by CR Wiley, Man of the House, and The Household and the War for the Cosmos. And if you've not yet done so, please hit subscribe on YouTube. Hit the like button on the video. Really appreciate it, and I will see you